She left the city and found herself in a deadly trap. But the one she had been taught to fear turned out to be her only salvation. See how this story ends. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The stagecoach rattled to a halt in a swirl of dust, its wheels grinding against the hard-packed earth of the small frontier town. The air was hot and heavy, carrying with it the mingled scents of horse sweat, tobacco smoke, and iron from the blacksmith's forge that rang steadily somewhere down the street. A row of weather-worn buildings stretched along the single main road. The saloon with its creaking double doors, the sheriff's office with a faded star painted on the window, a general store that displayed bolts of fabric already dulled by grit. Children darted in and out of the shadows, their bare feet kicking up dust as mothers scolded them in vain. Men leaned against porch posts with their hats pulled low, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt as they watched the newcomers arrive. The town was alive, but beneath the bustle there lingered something tight, as if the very air waited for a spark to ignite it. From the stagecoach descended Evelyn Harris, her gloved hand steadying herself on the railing as she stepped carefully to the ground. The hem of her pale dress swept lightly over her boots, instantly gathering dust. She stood out immediately, her fine clothes and straight posture clashing with the rough-spun shirts and worn skirts of the locals. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly beneath a broad-brimmed hat, her face shaded but not hidden. She was young, barely more than 20, with features that carried the softness of privilege. The townsfolk noticed her, their eyes lingering with curiosity and sometimes suspicion, for she was a reminder of a different world, one far away from the cracked boards and dusty windows of their own. Behind her came her father, Charles Harris, a man in his 50s with shoulders still broad from years of ranch work before wealth had softened his hands. He wore a suit that was almost too fine for this setting, the fabric heavy and expensive, his watch chain gleaming faintly in the harsh sun. He carried himself like a man who believed he owned whatever ground he stood upon, and in truth, in many ways he did. He was not just a rancher, he was an investor in the iron rails that had begun to slice through the wilderness, bringing profit to some and ruin to others. His presence here was not a social call, it was business. The railroad planned to drive its tracks deeper into Apache lands, and Charles Harris meant to see that nothing stood in the way of progress. Evelyn stood beside him, her face composed, though inside she was filled with restlessness. She looked around the town with keen eyes, taking in every detail, the cracked facades of the buildings, the restless shuffle of horses tied to the hitching posts, the lean dogs that trotted between wagons in search of scraps. To her, this was both repelling and fascinating. She had grown up in a large house with polished floors and servants who moved silently through the halls. But those walls had often felt more like a prison than a home. In this dusty town, everything seemed raw and alive, as though the world itself had not yet been tamed. The thought stirred something in her that she could not name, a yearning for freedom she rarely admitted to herself. The townsfolk whispered quietly about the Harris family's arrival. They spoke of money, power, and the inevitable clash with the native people whose lands the railroad would cut through. Tensions were already high. Farmers worried about their water rights, hunters grumbled about the vanishing game, and in hushed tones men spoke of the Apache. They were not faceless enemies, though some wished to believe so. Stories of raids and skirmishes circulated often, told with both fear and exaggeration. Mothers warned their children to stay close to home, while saloon patrons spoke boldly of driving the tribes out once and for all. Evelyn, overhearing snatches of this talk, felt the weight of it without fully understanding. Her upbringing had taught her to see such matters through the lens of her father's ambitions. Land meant wealth. Progress meant sacrifice. Yet something in the voices of the townspeople unsettled her, as though the world was larger and harsher than the careful narrative she had been given. In the following days, Evelyn struggled against the monotony of her father's routine. Charles Harris spent his hours in meetings with railroad men, land surveyors, and bankers who had come to this frontier outpost with their ledgers and maps. He left his daughter to the care of servants or expected her to entertain herself in the stifling parlor of the inn where they lodged. Evelyn's spirit chafed against these confines. She had never been one to sit quietly with embroidery, no matter how often she was told it was ladylike. Instead, she found herself pacing, gazing longingly through the windows at the wide horizons that stretched beyond the town. She could hear the call of the wilderness in the cry of a hawk circling above, in the sigh of the wind that rolled dust across the road. It taunted her, whispering promises of freedom that made her heart pound in a way no ballroom ever had. One afternoon, when her father was occupied and no one was watching too closely, Evelyn made her decision. She borrowed a horse from the stable, a bay mare with a calm disposition, and saddled it with more determination than skill. She had ridden before, in pastures and gardens, always under the watchful eyes of stable hands, but never beyond the boundaries of safety. Today she sought more. With a sense of both trepidation and exhilaration, she mounted and guided the horse out of town, the sun already sinking toward the west, casting long shadows across the land. The further she rode, the more alive she felt. The town fell away behind her, swallowed by the dusty horizon. Before her stretched the rugged landscape of Arizona, jagged ridges of red stone, valleys carpeted with sagebrush, and towering saguaro cacti that seemed to stand like silent sentinels. The air grew quieter the farther she went, broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional cry of a bird. She breathed deeply, inhaling the scent of dry earth and sun-warmed plants. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of joy. Her heart lifted. Here at last was something real. But nature, so magnificent in its beauty, held dangers that Evelyn did not understand. She urged her horse into a narrow wash, its sandy floor lined with dry reeds and brittle grasses. The walls of the wash rose steeply on either side, shadows pooling in their crevices. It was a place where flash floods sometimes roared, though today the bed was dry. The mare picked its way carefully, ears flicking nervously. Evelyn paid little mind, too enraptured by the strange silence, by the thought of sketching the scene later in her notebook. She dismounted for a closer look at a cluster of pale wildflowers clinging stubbornly to the cracked earth. It was then that the ground betrayed her. Her boots sank into the sand with a soft hiss, the soil beneath collapsing like water. She tried to step back, but her foot would not move. Panic jolted through her. She shifted her weight, and suddenly the earth gave way further, her leg plunging down into a hidden mire of thick mud and silt. She gasped, struggling, but every movement dragged her deeper. She called out, her voice echoing against the wash walls, startling a flock of birds into the sky. The horse whinnied sharply, pulling away to the edge of the wash, refusing to come closer. The quicksand held her fast. The more she fought, the more it swallowed. Her skirts grew heavy with wet soil, clinging to her legs as the mire climbed past her knees. Fear tore through her chest. She screamed again, desperate, her hands clawing at the crumbling edges, but they fell apart in her fingers. She thought of her father, of the house back home, of the empty parlors and endless silence of her life. Was this how it ended, in the middle of nowhere, devoured by the land she had longed to taste? Her strength was already waning, tears stinging her eyes as the mud rose higher. From beyond the wash, hidden by brush, a figure had already heard her cries. A man, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair falling loosely about his face, moved swiftly toward the sound. His clothing was simple, worn from long use, a deerskin shirt, leather leggings, and boots that bore the scars of countless miles. He carried no excess, only what he needed to survive. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the scene with the calm intensity of someone who knew the wilderness as well as his own breath. This was Kaito, a young Apache who had grown up learning the language of the land, each plant and stone a teacher, each scar on his body a lesson. He had not expected to find a white woman here, but the sight of her struggling in the deadly grip of quicksand left him no choice. He could not turn away. He dropped his bundle of supplies and searched swiftly for what he needed. A sturdy branch, a coil of rawhide rope he carried at his side. Moving with precision, he anchored one end to a rock outcrop and tied the other around his waist. He approached carefully, his steps measured so the ground would not give way beneath him. Evelyn's eyes widened when she saw him, fear and confusion battling in her expression. She reached toward him instinctively, her body trembling with exhaustion. He extended the branch, urging her silently to grasp it. She clutched desperately, and with a strength honed by years of survival, Kaito leaned back, his muscles straining as he pulled against the relentless suction of the mire. Inch by agonizing inch, he drew her free, mud sucking loudly at her legs until at last she collapsed onto the solid earth. Gasping, her body shuddering with the shock of near death. She lay there, barely able to move, her breath shallow. Kaito crouched beside her, his expression unreadable, but his actions careful. He checked her pulse, felt the faint rhythm of her heartbeat, and nodded to himself. She would live. Gently, he draped his blanket over her shoulders, shielding her from the chill that followed shock. Evelyn closed her eyes, the world spinning, and surrendered to the darkness that claimed her. When she opened them again, she was no longer in the wash, but in a small camp, the scent of smoke and herbs filling the air. She did not yet understand who had saved her, nor why, only that her life had been spared when she thought all hope was lost. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, vast and merciless. Inside the fragile circle of the camp, two lives that should never have crossed had been bound together by necessity, and the consequences of that encounter had only just begun. When Evelyn awoke again, it was to the crackle of fire and the faint fragrance of smoke and resin, not to the gurgle of mud pulling at her body. For a moment she lay still, afraid that the quicksand had only been a nightmare, broken by some cruel twist of her imagination. But when she lifted her head, her hair falling loose about her face in damp, muddied strands, she saw she was no longer in the treacherous wash. She was lying upon a blanket of animal hides spread across the earth, the texture rough beneath her palms. Above her stretched not a ceiling, but the canopy of open sky, muted now by dusk, where faint streaks of orange bled into the purples of oncoming night. Close by, a small fire snapped, sending sparks upward into the dark. Beyond it, silhouetted by the glow, she saw him. The man sat cross-legged on the ground, his figure still, his hands busy with some task she could not immediately discern. The fire cast his features into sharp relief, highlighting the angles of his cheekbones, the set of his jaw, the faint scars etched across his hands. His hair was dark and hung just past his shoulders, not neatly bound but kept back by a simple strip of rawhide. His clothing bore the wear of the wilderness, a shirt fashioned from deerskin, leggings patched with sinew where tears had been mended, moccasins that spoke of countless miles crossed in silence. He was utterly unlike any man Evelyn had ever known, not for his strangeness, but for the sense of quiet strength he radiated. He did not glance at her awakening. His focus was fixed on the piece of wood in his hands, which he carved slowly with a long knife, each motion measured and precise. Evelyn's first instinct was fear. Her upbringing, her father's stern warnings, the whispers of townsfolk, all of it pressed upon her in that moment. She had been told the Apache were savages, unpredictable and dangerous, men who stole cattle, who raided settlements, who killed without mercy. Yet here she was, not harmed but spared, covered in a blanket, her ankle bound where she must have twisted it in her frantic struggle. She shifted slightly, testing her weight. The blanket slipped from her shoulders and she realized with a flush of heat that her fine riding clothes were ruined, caked with dried mud, torn where the earth had fought to claim her. She was stripped of all the symbols of wealth and protection that had defined her life. She was only a frightened young woman in the care of someone she was supposed to fear. The Apache did not move when she stirred. His knife continued its path across the wood, shaving thin curls that fell soundlessly to the ground. The rhythm of his work was hypnotic, steady, as though he had done this countless times before. Evelyn drew the blanket more tightly around her shoulders, suddenly aware of the cold creeping into her bones now that the sun had dipped behind the ridges. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she watched him with a mixture of unease and something she could not yet name. Gratitude, perhaps, or bewilderment. As the hours passed, Evelyn began to observe more closely the world of his camp. It was simple, yet everything had its place. A woven pouch of dried berries hung from a branch. A water skin lay near the fire, its surface darkened from years of use. A bow rested carefully against a log, its string coiled neatly, arrows bound together with sinew and feathers. Nothing seemed wasted, nothing frivolous. Each object bore the mark of a hand that had crafted it with patience and need. She realized with a pang of shame that in her own home, she had never given thought to the making of things. Food had arrived at the table, clothes had been delivered to her wardrobe, wood had been chopped and stacked by unseen men. Here, everything existed because someone had worked for it. Her rescuer moved only when necessary. He added wood to the fire, poured water from the skin into a small metal cup, and stirred something that simmered faintly in a battered tin pot suspended above the flames. Evelyn's stomach clenched at the smell, earthy and plain, and she realized with embarrassment that she had not eaten since morning. She had been so consumed with her flight from the town, her desire for freedom, that she had not considered the simplest of needs. When he rose, he walked to where she sat, his steps soundless, and extended the cup of water toward her. His hand was steady, his eyes unreadable. She hesitated, then took it with trembling fingers. The water was warm from the fire, but it soothed her throat, dry from fear and exertion. She wanted to thank him, but her voice failed again, the words catching like stones. He did not linger. He turned back to his place by the fire and resumed his work, as if her gratitude mattered little. That night Evelyn lay awake upon the hides, staring at the stars that pricked the heavens with cold light. She listened to the sounds around her, the soft rustle of wind through dry grass, the distant cry of a coyote, the steady breath of the man who kept watch by the fire. She thought of her father in town, probably unaware of where she had gone, perhaps furious when he discovered her absence. She thought, too, of the quicksand, the helpless terror, the certainty of death, and then of this stranger who had pulled her from it without question, who had asked nothing, demanded nothing, simply acted. She did not understand him, but she could not deny what had been done. At dawn she found him already awake, crouched beside the embers as he coaxed new flame from the ashes. The morning air was cold, the horizon painted in pale shades of pink and gold. Evelyn sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tightly around her shoulders. She watched as he moved through his tasks with quiet efficiency, chopping wood into smaller pieces, stringing dried meat upon a line, checking the bindings of his bow. His world seemed governed by silence, yet not an empty silence. It was purposeful, filled with meaning she could not yet grasp. Evelyn's thoughts churned. She had been raised to believe her life was one of order and progress, a life destined to uphold her family's name and power. But in this small circle of firelight, she felt something stir within her that unsettled her certainties. She saw a man who lived with no excess, who seemed unburdened by the weight of wealth or social standing. His silence did not strike her as rudeness, but as strength, as if he had learned to speak with his hands and his presence rather than with words. Throughout the day, Evelyn attempted to contribute in small ways. She gathered stray sticks for the fire, though her fingers ached and her back complained from bending. She smoothed the edges of the hide upon which she had slept, though she knew it was unnecessary. She watched how he carved, how he bound together fibers, how he moved without wasted energy. She felt clumsy by comparison, a child fumbling in a world of adults. Yet she wanted to try, because for the first time she felt the weight of being more than ornamental. She wanted to prove, if only to herself, that she was not useless. By evening, when the fire cast long shadows across the camp once more, Evelyn sat quietly, her eyes upon him as he whittled another piece of wood. Her ankle throbbed, but the bandage he had made held firm, and she realized he had tended to her wounds with care. She thought of how he had lifted her from the mire, how his hands had been strong but never harsh. She did not know his name, nor what he thought of her, but she knew already that her life had been forever altered by the crossing of their paths. As night descended, she lay upon the hides again, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The flames flickered low, casting faint light upon his figure as he sat unmoving, a shadow carved from the wilderness itself. Evelyn closed her eyes, her heart conflicted. She was safe, yet more uncertain than ever. For in the silence of his camp, surrounded by the vastness of the desert, she realized she was no longer the same girl who had ridden foolishly into the wastelands. She was someone else now, though she did not yet know who. And as the stars turned overhead, the knowledge grew in her mind like a secret flame. The world her father had built with wealth and power was not the only one that existed. There was another, older, quieter, and it was here, in the company of an Apache whose silence spoke more than any words she had ever heard. When Evelyn finally saw the familiar rooftops of the town again, rising from the dust like a cluster of tired sentinels, her heart twisted with a sensation she could not quite name. It was neither relief nor dread alone, but a mixture of both. The journey back from the Apache's camp had been quiet, the sun climbing steadily higher, the horizon shimmering with heat. Kaido had walked beside her mare in silence, his hand occasionally steadying the reins when the animal balked at shadows or loose stones. She had wanted to speak, to tell him that she owed him more than she could ever repay, but each time she opened her mouth, the words dissolved. When the outline of the town finally grew clear, he slowed his pace, his figure blending naturally with the trees and brush, until with no ceremony at all, he slipped away. She turned in her saddle, desperate to watch him go, but within moments he was gone, as though he had never been. Evelyn entered the town alone, her clothing still bearing the stains of mud, and her hair falling loose in disarray. She expected curiosity from the townsfolk, and indeed they stared as she rode past, their eyes narrowing, lips whispering to one another. Some looked away quickly, others smirked with speculation, but none offered assistance. By the time she reached the inn where her father lodged, her stomach was a knot of unease. She dismounted with stiff limbs, her ankle still aching beneath the bandage, and scarcely had she set foot on the steps when the door burst open and Charles Harris himself emerged. His face was red with anger, his eyes hard as he took in her appearance. He did not shout in public, but the steel in his voice was sharp enough to cut. He grasped her arm firmly, drawing her inside before the curious eyes of the town could see more. Within the confines of their room, he finally let the words fly. He scolded her recklessness, her disobedience, the danger she had put herself in. She listened, her body trembling, not from fear of him, but from the exhaustion that had pressed on her since the quicksand. She wanted to tell him about Kaido, about the camp, about the quiet dignity of the man who had saved her. But she knew already what her father would say, and she swallowed the words, pressing them down until they burned. That evening, as she sat alone at the window, she listened to the town below. The saloon doors clattered as men stumbled in and out, their voices carrying through the night. Snatches of conversation drifted upward, fragments of the larger story unfolding. The railroad was coming, they said, and the line would cut through Apache land. Some claimed the company had already sent letters of warning, promising that resistance would be met with force. Others muttered that the army would soon be called, that it was only a matter of time before blood was spilled. Evelyn's chest tightened with every word. She knew now what that land looked like, what it meant to someone who lived upon it. She remembered the firelight flickering across Kaido's face, the reverence with which he seemed to treat the earth around him. The thought that men like her father could tear it away without hesitation filled her with a new kind of shame. Days passed, and the tension in the town thickened. Meetings were held in smoky back rooms, men huddled over maps with glasses of whiskey in their hands. Charles Harris was often among them, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed progress was his to command. Evelyn watched him return each night with a self-satisfied air, his talk filled with rail lines and profits, the promise of prosperity once the land was seized and the tracks laid. He spoke of the Apache only as an obstacle, never as people. It was then that Evelyn began to see her father differently, not as the towering figure of her childhood, but as a man whose ambition was sharp enough to cut through flesh if it stood in his way. One afternoon she ventured into the marketplace, her ankle still weak but bearable. She lingered near the stalls, pretending to examine bolts of cloth and jars of molasses, but in truth she was listening. Everywhere she went, the same rumors followed her. The Apache had sent warnings, they said, leaving symbols carved into posts, arrows planted in the ground near the surveying markers. A cattle herd had gone missing on the far range, and though no one had seen the raiders, many were quick to place blame. Evelyn heard the fear and prejudice woven together, the eagerness with which some clutched at any excuse to label the Apache as enemies. Yet she also saw the unease in others' faces, men and women who whispered that it was not right, that land could not simply be taken because powerful men willed it so. That night Evelyn attempted to broach the subject with her father. She spoke hesitantly of the land, of the people who might live there, of the possibility that forcing them away would bring ruin rather than prosperity. But Charles Harris silenced her with a look, his jaw clenched, his words clipped. He told her that she did not understand the weight of responsibility, that her sentiment was weakness unbecoming of his daughter. He spoke of progress, of duty to their family, of the inevitability of expansion. She listened, her throat tight, and knew there was no space in his world for compassion. She retreated into silence, but inside her a decision was forming, fragile but unyielding. The more she thought, the more the truth pressed upon her. She owed her life to an Apache. Without him, she would be gone, swallowed by the earth, her body hidden beneath sand and water. Yet in the eyes of her father, that man was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The contradiction tore at her. She could not reconcile the image of Kaido, quiet and strong by the firelight, with the monstrous caricature painted by those in town. And so she lay awake at night, her heart pounding, staring into the darkness, wondering what her silence would cost. It was on the 5th day after her return that she witnessed the preparations firsthand. She walked past the saloon and saw men loading rifles, checking the sights of their pistols. Wagons were being gathered, supplies stacked high. The talk was no longer of if, but when. Soon they would ride to the Apache lands and claim them for the railroad. The army might not be present yet, but the hired guns and desperate men of the town would be enough to force fear into any who resisted. Evelyn's stomach turned as she watched them. She thought of Kaido's camp, of the bow resting against the log, of the fragile peace of his world. She could not bear the image of fire and destruction sweeping through it. That evening she confronted her father once more. She spoke with more conviction this time, telling him that what he planned was wrong, that there must be another way. His response was harsher. He reminded her of her place, of the future he had planned for her, of the family's reputation that must be preserved. He dismissed her words as youthful naivety, a daughter's whimsy born from too much time in books. But Evelyn's resolve hardened. For the first time in her life, she felt that she must act, not simply accept. She could not allow silence to be her only answer. She withdrew from him, her heart heavy, her hands trembling, as she pressed them to the cool glass of the window that night. She looked out at the stars, at the endless sky that stretched beyond the horizon, and she thought of the Apache once more. Her life had been spared, and now she understood why. Not so she could return to the safety of her family's wealth, but so she could choose. Her father's world demanded obedience and silence, but her heart demanded truth. She knew then that the days ahead would test her more than she had ever been tested, that her path was no longer tied only to the name she bore. Something larger awaited her, something that would require more courage than she had ever imagined. And as the night deepened, Evelyn Harris lay awake with the weight of discovery pressing upon her chest. The knowledge that her father's ambitions, in the dignity of those who had saved her life, were on a collision course. She could not remain in the middle. She would have to choose where she stood when the clash came. The days that followed her father's last rebuke unfolded with a tension that clung to the town like heat before a storm. Evelyn sensed it in the hurried movements of men across the main street, in the hushed whispers of women at the market stalls, in the restless gait of horses tethered too long while their masters made plans behind closed doors. The saloon rang with laughter that was too loud, the kind that came when men tried to mask unease with bravado. Rifles were cleaned in plain view, pistols oiled and loaded, and maps passed from hand to hand, their edges darkened by grease and tobacco-stained fingers. The town had made up its mind, and the railroad company's will was about to be carried out, no matter the cost to those who stood in the way. Evelyn walked among these preparations with the sensation of being both present and absent, as though she moved through a dream she could not wake from. The faces around her blurred into one another, all hardened by fear, greed, or resignation. She thought constantly of the camp she had left behind in the wilderness, of the quiet dignity of the man who had saved her life, of the firelight dancing on his still face. It seemed impossible that the same men now boasting of conquest could imagine bringing violence to such a place. Yet she knew they would, and the knowledge gnawed at her until she could no longer keep silent. Her first act was born of impulse rather than design. On a morning when the town square gathered more people than usual, traders, farmers, ranchers, and curious onlookers, She stepped forward onto the wooden steps of the inn, her heart hammering, her breath shallow. Faces turned toward her, puzzled, some sneering, some curious to see what the daughter of Charles Harris would say. She had never spoken publicly before, never raised her voice above the confines of parlors and drawing rooms, but now, under the relentless sun, with the eyes of strangers fixed upon her, she found her words. She told them of her ride beyond the town, of her folly in wandering too far, of the quicksand that had nearly swallowed her whole. A murmur ran through the crowd at her candor, but she pressed on. She told them that she had been saved not by fortune, nor by the intervention of townsfolk, but by an Apache. Gasps followed, a few scoffs, but she did not stop. She painted the image as she remembered it, a man who had risked his life to pull her from the mire, who had asked nothing of her, who had shown care when he might have left her to die. She spoke of his camp, not as a lair of savages, but as a place of order and respect, a life lived in harmony with the land, rather than in conquest over it. The words fell heavily, some met with disbelief, others with a silence that suggested unease. There were those who mocked her, who said she had been bewitched, that she was naive. But there were others who frowned, whose eyes narrowed not in scorn, but in thought, as though her testimony had sown a seed of doubt. Evelyn's father, who stood among the gathered men, was livid. She saw it in the stiffness of his shoulders, in the flush rising along his neck. Yet he could not silence her without confirming to the world that she spoke truth. She stood her ground, her voice steady, and in that moment she realized she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The immediate effect was not revolution, but hesitation. The talk of marching upon Apache land grew quieter, the bravado dimmed by the discomfort of Evelyn's revelation. Newspapers carried whispers of her story, and men in town began to question what violence might bring upon them if it became known that they had slaughtered those who had shown mercy. The railroad company, ever watchful of its reputation, pressed pause, not out of compassion but out of caution. For the first time, the inevitability of the campaign wavered. Yet Evelyn knew the struggle was not won. Her father seethed in private, warning her that she had disgraced their name, that she had undermined the progress of civilization for the sake of sentiment. His words struck her, but no longer did they have the power to bend her will. The memory of Kaito's hands pulling her from death, of his silent watch over her as she slept, of the reverence in his stillness, all of it weighed heavier than her father's anger. She had chosen her path, and she would not turn from it. When the sun set that evening, she left the town behind once more. Her steps carried her into the wilderness with a certainty that startled her. Each mile drew her further from the world she had known, the world of polished floors and heavy curtains, of wealth and duty, of her father's unyielding hand. She returned to the places where the land opened wide and the sky bent close, where the silence was not oppressive but sacred. And in that silence she found the camp again, its outlines faint against the brush, the remnants of fire ashes gray against the earth. She stood there for a long while, her heart aching at the emptiness, until at last she saw him. Kaito stepped from the shadows as though he had always been there, as though he had been waiting for her. Their eyes met, and in that meeting there was no need for words. She did not tell him of the speech, of the crowd, of the fury of her father. He did not ask. Yet something passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement that she had chosen to stand not with blood, but with truth. The weeks that followed carried change neither swift nor simple. The company's men remained restless, the threat of violence never entirely gone. Yet Evelyn's voice had carved a crack in the foundation of certainty, and that crack grew. Some men refused to march, uneasy with the knowledge of what she had revealed. Others argued, their voices rising in taverns late at night. For the first time, doubt had entered the heart of the town, and doubt was a slow but powerful force. Evelyn spent more time at the edge of the wilderness, learning its rhythms in cautious steps, listening to the sounds that once had frightened her, but now brought comfort. She was no longer the girl who had wandered foolishly into quicksand, nor the child who sat obedient in parlors while men decided the fate of the world. She was something new, something uncertain, yet unshakable in its direction. Her world had been split open, and through the fracture came a path she had not known existed. Kaido remained distant, yet never absent. He did not speak of gratitude or allegiance, but she sensed in him an acceptance of her presence. He did not soften, did not alter his ways to accommodate her, and that honesty was a gift in itself. She watched him move through his tasks, through his silences, and understood that his life was not hers to shape. Yet for the first time, she felt her own life was hers to choose. When she returned to town again, she carried herself differently. The whispers followed her still, but now they slid off her like rain against stone. Her father no longer commanded her in the same way, for she had learned that obedience was not her fate. She had discovered another world, and within it, the possibility of a truth stronger than the weight of money or power. And so it was that Evelyn's life, once bound by duty and silence, became something else entirely. She had chosen not to be the daughter of Charles Harris, the obedient child of progress, but a woman who bore witness to mercy and carried it into the light. She could not know what battles still lay ahead, nor whether the fragile peace she had helped carve would hold. But she knew this. She had stood where silence demanded to be broken, and she had spoken. In the end, that choice bound her more deeply to the wilderness than to the marble floors of her father's house. It bound her to the memory of quicksand and firelight, to the image of a man whose silence had taught her more than a lifetime of words. The world of wealth and power still roared behind her, insistent and unyielding, but she no longer feared it. She had walked another path, and though uncertain, it was hers. And as she lay once more beneath the stars, the vast sky stretching unbroken above her, she felt not lost but found. The land that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her a choice, and in choosing, she had become free. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Make sure to check out our other videos for more powerful stories waiting for you. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.